can see I've titled the lesson Relative Difficulty, which is a bit of an oxymoron because difficulty for one is not necessarily difficulty for another. It's all what? Relative. But I'm not getting into esoteric kinds of things today. I'm talking about circumstances that probably each of us have come up against from time to time, and that is dealing with difficult family. And the text of the lesson is taken from Mark chapter 3, verses 31 through 35. Then Jesus' mother and brothers came to see him. They stood outside and sent word for him to come out and talk with them. There was a crowd sitting around Jesus, and someone said, "Your mother and your brothers are outside asking for you." And Jesus replied, "Who is my mother? Who are my brothers?" Then he looked at those around him and said, "Look, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does God's will is my brother and sister and mother." I want you to think about a word picture to describe a relative in your life who really annoys you. The single word parasite might be one of them. Maybe your wife has a brother who never works and always expects you and your family to provide. Or maybe it's a cactus that's wearing a silk blouse. She looks really nice, and everyone thinks that she's just the greatest, but you get close to her and she's a little prickly, kind of dry, thirsty for life. Or maybe a marble column describes that relative. Dignified, noble, high, and very hard. That's how it can be sometimes with difficult relatives. Stuck to someone with whom it is really difficult, if not almost impossible, to communicate. And it's not as if they're a neighbor from whom you could decide to move and leave and get away from. Or it's not like an employee that works in your company that you could fire them. They're family. And you can choose your friends, but as the saying goes, you can't choose you know who. So odds are you probably know not only that expression, but the application of that expression in your life. Because maybe you've got someone like that in your life, someone that you can't talk to, but you can't walk away from. Maybe it's a mother who whines, or an uncle who slurps his soup, or a sister who flaunts her figure, or a dad who's still waiting for you to get a real job, or a mother-in-law who wonders why her daughter married you. These are kind of sticky wicket type of relationships where we're stuck together with family, but it's still falling apart. It's like being in a crammed elevator. You know, people thrust together by chance on a very short ride and saying as little as possible to anyone else in the elevator. And then, once the ride stops, everybody gets off. The only difference is you'll eventually get off the elevator and you'll never see those people again. But not so with the difficult relatives, because you see them at family reunions. You see them at Christmas. You see them at Thanksgiving. You see them at Easter. You see them at weddings. You see them even at funerals. They will be there. And you'll be there sorting through some tough questions. Why does life have to be so relatively difficult? If we expect anyone to be sensitive to our needs, it's family members, right? When we hurt physically, we want our family to respond. When we struggle emotionally, we want our family to know. But sometimes they act like they don't know. And sometimes they even act like they don't care. In her book, Irregular People, Joyce Landorf tells of a woman who was in her 30s. And she learned that she had breast cancer and that she needed to have a modified radical mastectomy. Now, she and her mother seldom communicated, so the daughter was a little apprehensive about telling her mom about the upcoming surgery. One day over lunch, however, she decided to reveal the news to her mom. And she said, "Mother, I just learned that I am going to have a mastectomy." Mom is silent. The daughter, after moments have passed, asked Mom if she'd actually heard what she said. The mother nodded her head affirmatively, and then she calmly dismissed the subject by saying, "You know, your sister has the best recipe for chicken enchiladas." Right. What can you do when those who are closest to you, or should be, keep their distance? When you can't get along with others, but you can't get along with your own relatives? Does Jesus have anything to say at all about dealing with difficult relatives? Is there an example in the Bible that we can turn to where Jesus is bringing peace to even a painful family? And the answer is yes, we do. And it's because it's Jesus' family that he's speaking about. Now, I know most of you, it does not come as a surprise, but you know that these messages are broadcast, and I send them out by email to people who maybe don't go to church a whole lot. So I write in the lesson, it may surprise you, but Jesus had a difficult family. Maybe it surprises you to know that Jesus had a family at all. You may not be aware of the fact, but that Jesus had brothers and sisters. Because quoting one of Jesus' hometown critics, Mark writes in his gospel, from Mark chapter 6, verse 3, "Jesus is the carpenter, the son of Mary, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon. And his sisters are here with us too." So it may even shock you to know that not only did Jesus have brothers and sisters, but his family was not perfect. So if your family doesn't appreciate you from time to time, take heart, because neither did Jesus' family either. In fact, here's Jesus' own conclusion about living in his neighborhood. Mark chapter 6, verse 4. "A prophet is honored everywhere except in his hometown and with his own people and in his own home." I wonder sometimes what Jesus meant by those last words, "in his own home." Because he went to the synagogue where he was asked and invited to speak. And all the people who were there were proud that this hometown boy had done so well. They were thrilled to see Jesus in the synagogue speaking as he was speaking, until they actually heard what he said. He referred to himself as the Messiah, the one to fulfill prophecy. And so this crowd that had assembled together to see the hometown boy done good, now what is their response? They just heard the hometown boy say that he is the Messiah, and their response is, "Isn't this Joseph's son?" The translation to that is, "He ain't no Messiah. He's just like us. I mean, he's like the plumber's kid from down the street, or he's the accountant that has an office on the 3rd floor, or he's the construction worker who used to date my sister." God doesn't speak through familiar people, especially some little Jewish kid who grew up in our own backyard. And then, look what happens next. Luke chapter 4, verses 29 and 30. "But when they heard this," and that was Jesus referring to himself as the Messiah, "when they heard this, everyone in the synagogue was furious and angry. They sprang to their feet and drove him right out of town, taking him to the brow of the hill on which the synagogue had been built, intending to hurl him down bodily. But he walked straight through the whole crowd and went on his way. That's a pretty ugly moment, don't you think? Jesus' neighborhood friends tried to kill him. But even uglier than that is what we don't see in that text. I want you to notice what's missing. Note what words should be there, at least in my opinion, but aren't. For instance, I would like that verse to say, they intended to hurl him down bodily from the brow of the cliff or the hill, but Jesus' brothers came and defended him. I'd like to read that, but I don't, because it's not there. That's not what happened. When Jesus was in trouble, his brothers were either not around or potentially, worse yet, they were part of the mob. They weren't always invisible, though. There was a time when they spoke, Jesus' family. There was a time when they were seen with Jesus in public. Not because they were particularly proud of him, but because they were ashamed of Jesus. It says in Mark chapter 3, verse 21, his family went to get him because they thought he was out of his mind. Jesus' siblings thought their brother was a lunatic. They weren't proud of Jesus. They were embarrassed. He's off the deep end, Mom. You should hear what the people are saying about him. People say he's crazy. Yeah, somebody asked me why we don't do something about Jesus as a family. It's a good thing Dad isn't around to see what this Jesus is doing now. I mean, these are really hurtful words spoken by those people who are the very closest to Jesus. But it gets even worse. Here's some more. This is taken from John chapter 7, verses 3 through 5. So Jesus' brothers said to him, you should just leave here and go to Judea so your followers there can see the miracles you do. Anyone who wants to be well known does not hide what he does. If you're doing these things, show yourself to the world. Even Jesus' brothers didn't believe him. That's John's remark, not mine. And listen to the sarcasm that is dripping from those words that Jesus' brothers and family are saying to Jesus. They drip with ridicule. I mean, how does Jesus sometimes put up with these family members of his, these relatives? How can you believe in yourself when those who know you best don't? How can you move forward when your family keeps trying to pull you back? Or worse yet, want to commit you to an insane asylum? When you and your family have two totally different agendas, what do? Fortunately, Jesus, again, gives us some answers. It's worth noting, I think, church, that Jesus didn't try to control his family's behavior, nor did he let their behavior control his. He didn't demand that they agree with him. He didn't sulk when they insulted him. He didn't make it his mission to even try and please them. I think a lot of us have this fantasy that our family should be a lot like the Waltons, and an expectation that our dearest, most remembered friends are actually our next of kin. And that's kind of the idea you got with the Waltons, right? And sometimes I think we live in this artificial world in which we think that this is the way our family should work and look like and behave. Jesus didn't have that expectation. Look how he defined his family. This is Mark chapter 3, verse 35. Look, these are my mother and brothers. Anyone who does God's will is my brother and my sister and my mother. That was the text that we started this whole message with. Jesus is sitting in a house with individuals gathered around him. His family is demanding he come outside because they think he's crazy. And one person inside says, hey, your mom's calling for you. Your brothers are out there waiting for you. And Jesus says, who are they? Who is my mother? Who is my brother? It's these people. These people who are doing God's will. These people are my mother and my brothers. And I don't think Jesus was being flippant, suggesting that anybody could be his mother. I don't think that's what Jesus was saying. What he was saying is, my family is a family of people who believe and do God's will. That's my family. When Jesus' brothers didn't share his convictions, he didn't try to force them. He recognized what his spiritual family could provide and what his physical family apparently could not. The fact is, if Jesus himself couldn't force his family to share his convictions, what makes you think you can force your own? We can't control the way our family responds to us. When it comes to the behavior of others acting toward us, our hands are really tied. We have to move beyond this naive expectation that if we do good, people will treat us right. They may, and then again, they may not. If your brother's a jerk, you could be the world's best sister, and he still won't tell you so. If your aunt doesn't like your career, you could change jobs a dozen times and still never satisfy her. If your sister is always complaining about what you have and what she doesn't, you could give her everything and she still probably wouldn't change. As long as you think you can control people's behavior toward you, you're held in bondage by their opinions. If you think that you can control their opinion and their opinion isn't positive of you, then guess who you have to blame? Yourself. It's a game, church, with very unfair rules and very fatal finishes. And Jesus didn't play that game. And I'm encouraging you to not play that game either. We don't know, for instance, if Joseph actually affirmed his son Jesus' ministry, because we really don't know how long into Jesus' life Joseph actually lived. Joseph kind of disappears from the Bible when we see Jesus as a 12-year-old in the synagogue. We don't hear about Joseph after that. How much longer Joseph lived, we don't know. Obviously, Mary did. So we don't know if Jesus had an earthly father who encouraged him, who supported his ministry. We don't know that. But we do know that God did. Because in Matthew chapter 3, verse 17, God says of Jesus, "This is my son whom I love, and I am very pleased with him." I can't assure you that your family will ever give you the props or the blessings or the compliments that you seek. But God will. Let God give you what your family doesn't. If your earthly father doesn't affirm you, then let your Father in heaven take his place. Okay, well, how do you do that? By emotionally accepting God as your Father. Jesus referred to God in a number of terms, including the word Abba, which you still hear today in Israel. It means papa or daddy. It's a term of endearment and affection. Certainly Jesus referred to God the Father as the Creator as well. Jesus had a number of references to God that we've seen in the Bible. But Jesus had this affectionate aspect to him that looked to his Father as Papa, as God. Because it's one thing to accept God and Jesus as your Lord, and another thing to recognize him as your Savior, but it's another matter altogether to accept him as your Father. Because to recognize God as Lord is to acknowledge that he is sovereign and that he is supreme in the universe. To accept him as your Savior is to accept his gift of salvation that he offered on the cross. But to regard him as Father is to go another step further. Ideally, a father is one in your life who provides for you and who protects you. And that's exactly what God has done for us. He has provided for your needs. Matthew chapter 6, verses 25 and 34. He has protected you from harm. Psalm 139, verse 5. He has adopted you. Ephesians chapter 1, verse 5. And he has given you his name. 1 John chapter 3, verse 1. God has proven himself to each of us as a very, very faithful Father. Now, it falls upon each of us to then be very trusting children. Let God give you sometimes what your family cannot, or will not, or just does not. Let God fill the voids that others have left. Rely upon him for your affirmation and your encouragement. Look at Paul's words that he said to the church in Galatia, Galatians chapter 4, verse 7. You are God's child, and God will give you the blessing he promised. Why? Because you are his child. You see, having your family's approval is desirable, but it's not necessary for our happiness, and it's not always even possible. Jesus did not let the difficult dynamic of his family overshadow his call from God. And because he didn't, the chapter has a happy ending. So what happened to Jesus' family? This is Acts chapter 1, verses 12 and verse 14. Then the disciples went back to Jerusalem from the Mount of Olives. They all continued praying together with some women, including Mary, the mother of Jesus, and Jesus' brothers. Now that is quite a change, don't you think? The same brothers who wanted to possibly throw him over a cliff, or at least in the alternative, remove him from the streets as being crazy. And I don't know what Mary thought, but we know about the brothers' actions. Now all of a sudden in Acts, they're all waiting on Jesus. They're praying. They're together. Mary and the brothers. The ones who mocked him now worship him. The ones who pitied him now pray for him. So let me ask you, if Jesus had disowned his family, what do you think would have happened? Or worse yet, what if he had suffocated his family with his demand for change? You need to be more like me. Jesus didn't do that. He gave them space, and he gave his family time, and he gave his family grace. And because he did, they changed. How much did they change? Well, one of his brothers became an apostle. That's Galatians chapter 1, verse 19. And others became missionaries. That's 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. So when dealing with your own family, church, don't lose heart. It is easy, I know, to get discouraged. But don't lose heart. God still changes families. They're a bit like flowers in a bouquet. You know, there's always, have you noticed this? There's always one flower that is always determined in the bouquet to be different than all the other flowers. You know, you get them all just right. You buy those roses and they're all beautifully reflected and they're all looking around the vase. And there's that one stubborn rose that insists on facing the other direction because they just want to go against the designer. Well, church, our families are a bit like a bouquet of flowers. There's always usually one stubborn one in the bunch that does not want to go along with the designer. But it's still part of the bouquet. And it still adds beauty to the decoration. And it's still an important member. So when it comes to relative difficulty, sometimes our relatives can be difficult. But my encouragement to you is do what Jesus did. He didn't try to change his family. Jesus was who he was to do what he had come to do. And what we know from the end of the story is that by Jesus keeping focused on his purpose, because he was serving God, not his family eventually came around. Will that happen with your family? I don't know. But what we can take from the text is the fact that us as Christians, in dealing with difficult family members, we need to remember that our first responsibility is to God. And if we get that right, then at least we have some confidence, even from Jesus' own family, that they'll listen and that God will work in their lives and that perhaps they will change. And they're probably going to change more about what you don't do than what you do. What you don't do is you don't nag at them. You don't require them to change. You don't require them to be like you. You don't require anything of them. You just live your life as the Christian that God has created you to be. And you live your life in such a way that it's attractive to other people, maybe even including your own family. So if you're having a difficult time with relatives, try that approach and see if God doesn't bless your family because of your involvement and your commitment to serving God. And allow your family to come along. Give them some space. Give them some time. Give them some grace. Because Jesus did, even with his own family. So we're going to sing this next song. And as we sing this song, if you have any prayer requests that you want to hand up, you can do that while we sing. And at the conclusion of that song, we'll read those prayer requests, and then we'll be dismissed. Let's stand and let's sing.